The courtroom was dead silent. Every eye in the room fixated on one man, Brandon Cole, the billionaire, the genius, the monster. He sat back in his chair, arms crossed, a smug smirk plastered across his face. He refused to stand, defiant, untouchable. At the front of the room, Judge Maya Carter, young, brilliant, and the first black woman to hold this seat, watched him from the bench. Her expression? Unreadable. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice calm but firm. "In my courtroom, everyone stands when the judge enters." Brandon let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Not today," he said, leaning back further. His voice dripped with arrogance. "Not for you." Gas filled the courtroom. Even the security guards shifted uncomfortably. The lawyers exchanged nervous glances. The cameras were rolling. This trial was global news, and Brandon Cole had just declared war. But Judge Carter? She didn't flinch. Not even a flicker of emotion crossed her face. She simply tilted her head, studying him like a puzzle she had already solved. Then, without breaking eye contact, bam! The gavel struck down like a gunshot. And just like that, the world was reminded that Brandon Cole wasn't in control anymore. 24 hours earlier, everything had been different. Brandon Cole was a god, the king of Wall Street, the mastermind behind Cole Industries, a trillion-dollar empire, money, power, influence. He had it all. He didn't just play the system, he owned it. He controlled industries, bought politicians like chess pieces, and dictated the future of global markets with a single whisper. But arrogance had always been his greatest weakness. And now, it had finally caught up to him. The scandal hit like an earthquake. Fraud, insider trading, bribery, millions of dollars stolen. Every crime he thought he could get away with, laid bare for the world to see. For years, the authorities had been after him, but they never had enough evidence. Until now, the arrest had been humiliating. The FBI storming his penthouse, dragging him out in handcuffs while paparazzi snapped photos. His face was everywhere. The mighty Brandon Cole brought to his knees. But he wasn't afraid. He was furious, because they weren't treating him like a king anymore. They were treating him like a criminal. His legal team did everything, every trick, every loophole, every bribe. But nothing worked. The judge denied every request, rejected every motion. And then, Brandon found out who the judge was, Maya Carter. And that changed everything. Maya Carter, a young black woman barely in her 40s with a reputation for being unyielding. She had built her career taking down the rich and powerful. No one had ever bought her. No one had ever intimidated her. Had laughed when he heard a black woman. He had sneered in his lawyer's office sitting over me. "You've got to be kidding me." Sheck, the best judge in the state, his lawyer had warned. "She's sharp, fair, and she hates corruption. She's not going to play games with you." Brandon hadn't listened because in his mind there was no way some woman, especially a woman like her, could bring him down. And now, sitting in this courtroom, facing the person who held his fate in her hands, he decided to show her exactly what he thought of her. By refusing to stand by, refusing to acknowledge her authority, and she had answered with a single shocking move, the room had erupted in chaos. The gavel strike echoed like a gunshot. "Then all rise." Her voice rang out again, sharper this time. The bailiffs moved forward. Lawyers whispered among themselves. The audience watched wide-eyed. But Brandon just smirked. He thought he had won. Oh, but he had no idea what was coming next. The gavel strike still echoed through the courtroom like a war drum. The air was thick with tension, eyes darting between Judge Maya Carter and the man who had just refused to stand for her. Brandon Cole's smirk was wide, arrogant, triumphant. He thought he had something that he had put her in her place. But he didn't know Maya Carter without breaking her composure. The judge leaned forward, resting her elbows on the bench. Her brown eyes locked onto his, steady, unreadable. Then, in a voice so calm, it sent a chill down the spine of everyone present, she said, "Mr. Cole, you seem to be under the impression that this courtroom belongs to you, that these rules don't apply to you, that I don't apply to you." Brandon chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "That's one way to put it." Maya smiled a small, knowing smile. BFF, the uniformed officer, stepped forward. "Yes, Your Honor, remove Mr. Cole from my courtroom now." The smirk on Brandon's face vanished. "What, you heard me?" Maya said, her voice unwavering. "Remove him, he can watch." The proceedings from a holding cell, gasps rippled through the courtroom. The defense attorneys jumped to their feet, voices overlapping. Your Honor, that's completely unnecessary. You can't do that. Brandon's voice was no longer amused. It was outraged. Maya ignored them all. Mr. Cole has made it clear he does not respect this court. He will be held in contempt and removed until he is ready to behave like an adult BFF. The two officers moved. Brandon jerked back in his seat. You touch me, and I'll sue you. For the first officer grabbed his arm. Brandon lunged a chair, scraped violently against the floor. Gasps filled the air as the billionaire yanked his arm free and spun toward the approaching officers. His face was red with fury. I dare you to lay another hand on me. Maya remained still, watching the scene unfold as though she had seen it all before. The BFFs weren't faced. They had dealt with violent offenders, gang leaders, and career criminals. A rich man throwing a tantrum wasn't new. Brandon swung at one of them. That was his mistake. The courtroom exploded into chaos. The BFFs moved like train fighters. One grabbed Brandon's arm and twisted it behind his back. The other forced him forward over the desk, pinning him. Papers went flying. His expensive watch clattered onto the floor. Get off me, he shouted, struggling and wildly, his suit crumpling. Do you know who I am? The entire courtroom watched in stunned silence. A few reporters scribbled furiously into their notepads. The cameras clicked. The mighty Brandon Cole, trillionaire industry, King Wall Street God, was being dragged out of the courtroom like a common criminal. Maya Carter leaned back in her chair. She said nothing as they took him. She didn't have to. Brandon's roars echoed down the hall as the doors swung shut behind him. The silence that followed was heavy. The world had just witnessed something unprecedented. Judge Maya Carter turned her gaze back to the stunned courtroom. Shall we proceed? She asked calmly. 2 hours earlier, Brandon had been in his private holding cell, preparing for what he assumed would be another charade. His legal team had assured him they would get him out of this mess. It's all politics, they had said. The government wants to make an example out of you. They won't win. Brandon had smirked, sipping his imported coffee. They never do. He had been through lawsuits before. Fines hearings, it was all part of the game. He had always paid his way out. Money solved everything. But this case was different this time. It wasn't just about fines. This was about prison. They had him on financial crimes, fraud, money laundering, bribery. The government had finally put together enough evidence to take him down, and the judge assigned to him stepped forward. Let's see what she's got. Brandon Cole walked back into the courtroom like a man returning to his throne. The humiliation of being dragged out still burned inside him, but he buried it deep beneath his arrogance. He had spent his entire life commanding respect, bending people to his will. He wasn't about to let some small-time judge treat him like a criminal. As the door swung open, the entire courtroom turned to him. The cameras zoomed in. Reporters whispered they had seen him taken away in disgrace. Now they were watching to see what he would do next. He smirked. Let them watch. The BCFs led him to his seat. His lawyers shot him a warning glance, silently pleading for him to behave. Judge Maya Carter sat on the bench, flipping through a file, as if she hadn't just made a billionaire look like a fool in front of the world. Her face was calm, unbothered. Brandon clenched his jaw. He hated that. She wasn't even shaken by his presence. The beloved stepped forward. All rise. Brandon stayed seated for a second. The entire room froze. A ripple of murmurs moved through the spectators. His lawyers tensed. His smirk widened, then the gavel slammed. Down, bam. Judge Carter didn't look up from her papers. Mr. Cole, I don't believe you understand how this works. Brandon leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Oh, I understand perfectly. The room was silent. Judge Carter finally met his gaze. Good, then, you'll understand this. She turned to the BFF. Take him back. Gasps filled the room. Brandon's smirk vanished. Excuse me. The BFF stepped toward him. Judge Carter continued, her tone. Casual, almost bored, clearly. Mr. Cole isn't ready to follow the rules of this court. He'll remain in a holding cell until he learns some manners. Brandon shot up from his chair. You can't, I can, and will. She interrupted smoothly. BFF before he could react. The BFFs grabbed him again. Brandon yanked his arms back. You have no right, you're nothing but a... The courtroom erupted into chaos. The cameras flashed wildly as Brandon struggled against the officers. His voice rang out, filled with rage. Do you know who I am? The BFFs forced him toward the doors. You regret this, Carter, he bellowed. You think you can embarrass me? Judge Carter didn't respond. She simply watched as he was dragged away again. This time the courtroom didn't just murmur. It erupted, people whispered, reporters rushed to write down notes. Even Brandon's own lawyers exchanged underlooks. This wasn't how things were supposed to go, but Maya Carter didn't flinch. She tapped her gavel lightly. Proceed, she said, and just like that, the case continued. Brandon sat alone in his cell, his pulse pounding. He had never felt this kind of anger before this woman. This nobody was treating him like trash, like a common criminal. He paced the small space, his hands clenched into fists. This wasn't just about the case anymore. This was personal. Nobody humiliated Brandon Cole. Nobody his legal team had tried to visit him again, but he had thrown them out. He didn't want to hear their whining about playing nice. No, he was going to destroy her. Judge Carter thought she was powerful, that she had control. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Brandon wasn't just rich, he owned people. And it was time to remind the world exactly who was in charge. With a slow, dark smile, he sat back against the wall, tapping his fingers together. It was time to make a call. 3 hours later, Judge Maya Carter stepped into her office, closing the door behind her. She let out a small sigh, pressing her fingers against her temple. The day had been exhausting. Brandon Cole was unlike any defendant she had ever dealt with. She had seen arrogance before. She had sentenced powerful men who thought the law didn't apply to them. But there was something different about Brandon, something dangerous. He wasn't just a man throwing a tantrum. He was a man who believed the world belonged to him. She walked over to her desk, flipping through the case files. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His empire had been built on lies, corruption, and greed. He had ruined lives, stolen millions, and laughed while doing it. And now he was furious because, for the first time, someone had told him no. A knock at the door made her look up. Her clerk, Daniel, peeked in. Judge, I think you need to see this. She frowned. What is it? Daniel stepped inside, holding up a tablet. She took it, glancing at the screen, and what she saw made her freeze. Brandon Cole was trending not because of his courtroom meltdown, because of her headlines filled the screen. Rogue judge humiliates billionaire, abuse of power. Brandon Cole denied basic rights in courtroom chaos. Judge Maya Carter goes too far. Is this about race? Maya's grip on the tablet tightened. They spinning it against you, Daniel said quietly. Maya exhaled slowly. She had expected backlash. Brandon Cole had connections. He had power, but she hadn't expected this fast. The story was already out. She was being painted as the villain. Her heart pounded, but her face remained calm. She placed the tablet down and looked at Daniel. Schedule a meeting with the Chief Justice, she said. Daniel hesitated. You think they're going to? I don't know, she admitted, but I need to be ready, because this wasn't just a trial anymore. This was a war, and she had just become Brandon Cole's next target. Maya Carter sat in the Chief Justice's office, her hands folded neatly on the table in front of her. Across from her sat Chief Justice Roland Hayes, an older man with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor. The walls were lined with law books, and the air smelled of leather and coffee. She had been in this room before, but never like this. Judge Carter, Chief Justice Hayes, began setting down a newspaper with her name splashed across the front. We have a problem. Maya didn't flinch. She had already seen the headlines. She had already read the twisted version of the story being pushed by Brandon Cole's people. They were painting her as the villain, a biased judge, a power-hungry activist. Some outlets even hinted that she had racially targeted Brandon Cole. It was absurd. It was dangerous. Maya took a deep breath. Sir, I followed the law. He refused to stand, refused to respect the court. I don't disagree with your decision, Hayes interrupted. But you need to understand something. Brandon Cole is not just another defendant. He has power, influence, and right now he's using every bit of it to turn this case into a public spectacle. Maya's jaw tightened. So what are you saying? Hayes sighed, rubbing his temples. I'm saying that if this continues, the Judicial Committee may start asking questions. They might push to have you removed from the case. Maya's stomach clenched, but her face remained calm. Removed. Brandon wanted that. That was his game. He wasn't just fighting the case in court. He was fighting it in the media. He was turning the world against her. Maya met Hayes. Gaze, are you telling me to step down? Hayes shook his head. No, not yet, but you need to be careful. Do not give him any more ammunition. Maya exhaled slowly. Understood. But inside, she was already planning her next move. Brandon Cole leaned back in his private holding cell, a lazy smirk on his lips as he watched the news on the small screen mounted to the wall. The med was doing exactly what he wanted. Reporters were dissecting Maya Carter's history, questioning her rulings, suggesting she had a personal vendetta against powerful men. They were turning her into the problem. Good, that was step one. Step two, breaking her completely. Brandon turned as the cell door opened and his lead attorney, Jonathan Reeves, stepped inside. "Looks like your little PR stunt worked," Reeves said, crossing his arms. "They're already talking about getting her removed," Brandon chuckled. "Did you really think I was going to sit in here and let her embarrass me?" Reeves didn't smile. "Brandon, you need to be careful. You're winning the media war, but in the courtroom she still has the power." Brandon's smirk didn't waver, not for long. Reeves hesitated. "What are you planning?" Brandon stood adjusting his suit. "Oh, nothing." His voice was casual, but his eyes gleamed with something dark. "Just making sure that Judge Carter remembers her place." Reeves frowned. Brandon, help, held up a hand. "Relax, Jonathan. I'm just going to remind her who she's dealing with." Reeves didn't look convinced, but Brandon didn't care. He had been humiliated once. It wouldn't happen again that night. Maya Carter pulled into her driveway exhausted, but determined. The meeting with Chief Justice Hayes had only solidified what she already knew. Brandon Cole was trying to intimidate her, but she wasn't afraid of him. She had faced worse as she stepped out of her car. The crisp night air filled her lungs. The neighborhood was quiet, the street lights casting long shadows over the pavement. She walked up to her front door, her mind racing with everything she needed to do next. Then she saw it, a single white envelope tucked into her doorframe. Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting any mail. Frowning, she pulled it free and opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper. For words were written in bold black ink. "Step down or else." Maya's breath caught in her throat. She slowly looked around, scanning the dark street, the parked cars, the quiet houses. Nothing. No one, but someone had been here. Someone had left this threat. Her hands tightened around the note. Brandon, it had to be him. He was playing dirty. Maya inhaled deeply, forcing herself to stay calm. She wasn't the kind of woman who backed down. If Brandon Cole wanted a war, then he had just started one. Maya Carter stood on her porch, gripping the note in her hand. Her heart was pounding, but her face remained still. She had received threats before it came with the job. But this was different. This wasn't from some random criminal. This was personal. This was Brandon Cole. She stepped inside her house, locking the door behind her. The silence of her home felt heavier than usual. She took a slow breath, then pulled out her phone and dialed a number. A few rings. Then, "This is Detective Langley, it's Carter." There was a pause. Then a sigh. "What happened? I need you to come by my house," she said, her voice steady now. "Langley didn't ask questions on my way." Maya placed the note on her kitchen table and sat down, her mind racing. Brandon Cole wanted her to be afraid, but fear wasn't in her nature. Brandon sat in his holding cell, waiting. The game had begun. He didn't need to send the note himself. He had people for that, people who would do far worse if necessary. Maya Carter thought she could humiliate him in court. She thought she could treat him like some common criminal. She was about to learn the truth. He wasn't just powerful, he was dangerous. And people who crossed him never walked away. And scathed, the sound of the door opening made him glance up. Jonathan Reeves stepped inside, his face tight with concern. "Brandon, what the hell did you do?" Brandon smirked. "That's a broad question. Jonathan, you have to be more specific." Reeves threw a folder down onto the table. "This just came through from the prosecution's office. They're moving to have your bail revoked." Brandon raised an eyebrow. "Bail? I don't even have bail yet. They were going to consider it." Reeves snapped. "Now, after your little performance in court and the media storm you kicked up, they want you locked up until trial." Brandon chuckled. "Let them try." Reeves wasn't laughing. "Brandon, listen to me. The judge still holds the power. In this case, she can make things very difficult for you." Brandon leaned forward. "Not for long." Reeves hesitated. "What are you planning?" Brandon simply smiled. "You'll see soon enough." Detective Langley arrived at Mea's house within 20 minutes. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a no-nonsense attitude Maya had always respected. As soon as he stepped inside, she handed him the note. Langley read it, his jaw tightening. "Where did you find this?" "Tucked in my door." Langley exhaled through his nose. "You have cameras?" Maya shook her head. "Not outside, just inside." Langley rubbed his temple. "You know who sent this?" Maya full-folded her arms. "Brandon Cole?" Langley's lips pressed into a thin line. "We don't have proof of that. We don't need proof. We both know how men like him operate." Langley didn't argue. He had been a cop long enough to know that powerful men rarely got their hands dirty. They sent messages, and when those didn't work, they escalated. Langley placed the note into an evidence bag. I'll get forensics on it, but if he's smart, there won't be fingerprints. Maya nodded. I figured Langley studied her. Maya, this is serious. I know if you step on the wrong toes, they don't just push back. They crush. Maya met his gaze. Let them try. Langley sighed. You're the most stubborn woman I know. She smirked. You say that like it's a bad thing. Langley shook his head. At least let me assign you protection. Maya hesitated. I don't. No arguments. Langley cut in. Brandon Cole isn't a small-time thug. He's got money influence. If he wants you gone, he won't stop at threats. Maya clenched her jaw. She hated feeling like she needed protection. But Langley was right. She wasn't just fighting a case. She was fighting a man who believed he was untouchable. She nodded fine. Langley nodded back. I'll have 2 officers outside your house tonight, and Maya? She raised an eyebrow. Langley's voice was firm. Be careful. The next morning, Maya arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. She walked through the marble hallways, her heels clicking against the floor, her mind sharp and focused. Today she wasn't just running a courtroom. She was sending a message as she stepped inside. The eyes of the world were on her. Reporters lined the halls, their cameras flashing. The media was still buzzing from yesterday's events. And at the center of it all, Brandon Cole, the guards, led him into the courtroom, his hands cuffed in front of him. But even in cuffs, he looked smug, arrogant, untouchable. Maya took her seat at the bench, her face unreadable. All rise, the BFF announced. Brandon stood this time, but not out of respect, no. He did it mockingly, a slow, exaggerated movement followed by a smirk. MAA didn't react. She simply tapped her gavel. Mr. Cole, you are now facing additional contempt charges. Do you understand? Brandon chuckled. Oh, I understand perfectly. His voice was smooth, confident, like a man who knew something she didn't. Maya narrowed her eyes. She had spent career reading people. And right now, Brandon Cole was waiting for something big, and whatever it was coming fast. Judge Maya Carter studied Brandon Cole from the bench, her expression unreadable. Something was wrong. Brandon stood before her, his hands still cuffed, but the smirk on his face wasn't the smirk of a man who had lost. It was the smirk of a man who knew he was about to win. Maya didn't like it. She turned to the prosecutor. Proceed. The prosecutor, David Ramirez, cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. Your Honor, given Mr. Cole's repeated disregard for courtroom decorum and his clear attempt to obstruct justice, the state formally moves to revoke any possibility of bail and requests that he remain in custody until trial. Maya noted. Mr. Reeve. Your response. Brandon's lawyer, Jonathan Reeves, stood slowly. He looked uneasy, even he wasn't comfortable with Brandon's antics. Your Honor, he began carefully. My client recognizes that his behavior in court has been spirited. Brandon snorted. Reeves shot him a quick glare before continuing. However, we argue that he is not a flight risk. Mr. Cole has deep ties to the community. His businesses employ thousands, and there is no reasonable justification for keeping him incarcerated before trial. Maya tapped her fingers against her desk. She had expected this. What she hadn't expected was the smug, relaxed way Brandon stood there, as if this was all just a formality, as if he already knew what she was going to say. That feeling in her gut twisted tighter. M.A. took a slow breath and straightened. Mr. Cole has demonstrated blatant disrespect for this court, and I see no indication that he intends to take these proceedings seriously as such. The doors to the courtroom suddenly burst open. A man in a sharp suit strode in, flanked by 2 other attorneys. He moved with confidence, his briefcase in hand, his expression unreadable. The room turned to him, murmurs breaking out. Brandon's smirk grew wider. Maya's stomach dropped. The man stopped just short of the defense table and cleared his throat. Your Honor, my name is Richard Calloway. I am Mr. Cole's new attorney. Reeves stiffened beside Brandon, his face paling. Maya frowned. Mr. Calloway, I was not informed of any changes in legal representation. Calloway smiled politely. Apologies, Your Honor. The paperwork was filed this morning. Mr. Reeves will, of course, be stepping down as lead counsel. Reeves looked like he had just been punched in the gut. Brandon, however, looked thrilled. Ma's fingers tightened around her gavel. Calloway's name wasn't unfamiliar. He was a fixer, a legal shark, the kind of attorney billionaires called when they needed their problems to disappear. The worst kind of lawyer. Calloway turned to the prosecution. Given this change, Your Honor, We respectfully request a postponement before any decisions are made regarding Mr. Cole's bail. Maya narrowed her eyes, and why would I do that? Quay didn't blink because, Your Honor, as of this morning, new evidence has emerged. Evidence that changes everything? The room exploded into whispers, make heart pounded. What evidence? Calloway smiled, his eyes sharp. We have obtained proof that my client is being unfairly targeted, that this case is not about justice, but about bias. Ma's pulse quickened. There it was, the trap. Brandon hadn't been waiting to hear her ruling. He had been waiting for this, Your Honor. Calloway continued, smoothly stepping forward. We have evidence that Judge Carter has a personal bias against my client, and on that basis, we are filing an official motion to have you removed from this case. Maya's breath caught. A stunned silence filled the courtroom. Then chaos reporters scrambled to type notes. The prosecutor turned, whispering furiously with his team. Brandon's old lawyer, Reeves, looked like he wanted to disappear. But Brandon just grinned. May's jaw tightened. On what grounds? Calloway calmly reached into his briefcase, pulling out a folder. Your Honor, over the past week, multiple media outlets have raised concerns about your impartiality. We have collected statements, prior rulings, and social media commentary that suggest a clear pattern of bias against wealthy defendants, particularly men in positions of power. Maya's stomach turned. That's absurd. Calloway shrugged, perhaps, but the perception of bias is enough. And now, with the public questioning your motives, we argue that you cannot provide a fair trial. The prosecution shot to their feet. Your Honor, this is nothing more than a distraction. Calloway held up a hand. We aren't asking for much. We are simply requesting that another judge take over this case. One who does not have such strong opinions about people like Mr. Cole. Maya's fingers dug into the desk. They weren't trying to win the case in court. They were trying to get rid of her. This wasn't a legal strategy. This was a power move. And the worst part, it just might work. Maya exhaled slowly. I will review your motion, however. Until a decision is made, these proceedings will continue. Calloway nodded, unbothered. Of course, Your Honor. Maya turned to the prosecution. Mr. Ramirez, continue. Ramirez hesitated, then straightened. Your Honor, in light of Mr. Collett's continued obstruction, we maintain that his bail should be revoked. Maya met Brandon's gaze. He didn't look worried. He looked amused. Ma's fingers tightened around her gavel. She couldn't let them push her out, but the world was watching. If she ruled against Brandon, now it would look like she was retaliating. And if she ruled in his favor, he would win. Brandon knew it. He had backed her into a corner. Maya inhaled sharply, then in a steady voice she spoke. I will take the motion into consideration. However, given the circumstances, I will not be making a bail decision until after my review. Brandon chuckled under his breath. He had won. This round, Maya tapped her gavel cord as adjourned the moment she stepped away from the bench. She felt every camera in the room focus on her. Brandon Cole had played his hand, and now she had to find a way to beat him before it was too late. Maya Carter Storr formed into her chambers, her heartbeat hammering against her ribs. She shut the door behind her and let out a slow breath. Brandon Cole was playing a dangerous game, and for the first time since this case began, she realized he might actually win. The knock at her door came fast, sharp. She already knew who it was. Come in. The door swung open and David Ramirez stepped inside, his face tight with frustration. Judge Carter, what just happened in there? Maya pinched the bridge of her nose. Cole happened and Calloway. Ramirez threw his hands up. They just put a massive target on your back. If that motion goes through, you'll be off this case. And you know what happens if you're gone? He'll walk. He'll get a judge in his pocket, and this whole thing will disappear. Maya knew that was the plan. Brandon Cole wasn't just fighting her in court. He was fighting her outside of it. And if she lost, justice would never touch him. She sat down, rubbing her temples. They want me to overreact. If I did not, him bail now. After that stunt, it'll look like I'm proving their point. Ramirez exhaled sharply. So what do we do? Maya lifted her head, her mind sharpening. They expected her to play defense. They expected her to react. No, it was time to go on the offensive. Get me everything on Calloway, she said. I want to know who he's worked for, what cases he's pulled. Tricks like this in, if there's dirt, I want it. Ramirez hesitated, then nodded. I'll see what I can find. And one more thing, Maya added, we need to make this public. Ramirez frowned. What do you mean? Maya leaned forward. Right now, they control the narrative. They're painting me as a biased judge. But what happens if we put the truth out first? Ramirez's eyes widened. Leaks, he whispered. Maya nodded. We expose him. If the public sees who Brandon Cole really is, if they see his history of corruption, his history of silencing people. Then their argument against me falls apart. Ramirez stared at her for a moment, then slowly he smiled. You're playing chess, he murmured. A smirked, and Cole's about to lose his queen Brandon. Cole sat in his holding cell legs, crossed whistling his new lawyer. Richard Calloway sat across from him, flipping through documents. You've made a mess, Calloway said without looking up. Brandon chuckled. I made a spectacle, Calloway sighed. You're enjoying this too much. Brandon leaned forward. You saw her face. She's shaken. She knows she's cornered now. We just have to let the public pressure take care of the rest. Calloway finally glanced up, assuming she doesn't fight back. Brandon scoffed. Carter's a judge, not a politician. She plays by the rules. That's why she's going to lose. Calloway hesitated. Brandon narrowed his eyes. What? Calloway shut the folder and placed it down carefully. I did some digging. Brandon waved a hand and Calloway leaned in. Maya, Carter isn't just some random judge. She's got connections. You think you're untouchable, so does she? Brandon frowned. Connections to who? Calloway's voice lowered. Federal prosecutors, law enforcement, even high-ranking political figures. He tapped the folder. She's not just fighting for her reputation. She's fighting to make an example out of you. Brandon's smirk faded for the first time since this trial started. Something crawled under his skin, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Unease. Then we hit her harder, Brandon said coldly. Calloway hesitated. Brandon, no. Brandon's voice was sharp. I don't care what it takes. I don't care what you have to do. I want her gone. Calloway exhaled. I hope you know what you're doing. Brandon's eyes gleamed. Oh, I do. The attack came the next morning. Maya had just entered the courthouse when the reporters swarmed Judge Carter. Do you have a response to the accusations? Is it true you have a personal vendetta against Brandon Cole? Are you going to recuse yourself from the case? Maya kept walking, her face unreadable, but inside her blood boiled. Cole was escalating. She stepped into the courtroom, but before she could take her seat, Daniel, her clerk, rushed up to her judge. He whispered urgently, we have a problem. Maya frowned. What is it? Daniel handed her his tablet. Maya's stomach dropped. The headlines were everywhere. New evidence suggests Judge Maya Carter has hidden conflicts of interest. Did she have personal dealings with co-competitors? Secret emails raised questions about Carter's impartiality. Maya's mouth went dry. Where did this come from? She demanded. Daniel's voice was tight. Cole's legal team leaked it. They claiming you've had financial ties to businesses hurt by Cole's empire. Maya's hands curled into fists. Lies, fabrications. But that didn't matter because now it wasn't just a legal battle. It was personal, and the world was watching. Maya inhaled sharply, stooting herself fine. Brandon Cole wanted a war. Then she'd give him one, and when she was done, he wouldn't just lose the case. He'd lose everything. The day felt like it was pressing in on Maya. Carter from all sides, the press was relentless. The accusations against her grew with each passing hour, and the whispers in the courthouse hallways felt like 1,000 knives scraping against her nerves. She had spent hours in her chambers that morning, poring over legal documents, looking for a crack in the case that she could exploit. But there was no break. The evidence against Brandon Cole was solid, and the law was on her side. Yet with each new headline calling her integrity into question, the walls seemed to be closing in. She had already made one phone call to a trusted reporter who had worked with her on several high-profile cases. Everything set up, the reporter assured her, speaking in a low voice, so no one could overhear. The truth about Cole's dirty dealings will be out by tonight. Maya smiled grimly. Make sure it goes viral. She knew that if she didn't act soon, the damage to her reputation would be irreversible. She couldn't wait for the system to work this time. She needed to take action, and fast. Brandon Cole sat in his cell, his fingers drumming impatiently on the metal table. He had been watching the media storm unfold for hours, and every time a new accusation was leveled at Judge Carter, his smile grew wider. The media was on his side now. Even the people who didn't know the truth were starting to believe it. And once that seed of doubt was planted in their minds, it was impossible to remove. But there was more to do. He couldn't stop now. Not when she was this close to being out of the picture entirely. Calloway, Brandon said, his voice low but intense. Calloway, sitting across from him, looked up from the papers in his hand. What now? Brandon leaned forward, his gaze dark. I want a personal meeting with Judge Carter. I want to look her in the eye and watch her break. It's time to put the final nail in the coffin. Calloway's brow furrowed. A meeting. Brandon's smile widened. Yes, she's playing by the rules, but she doesn't realize that I can play a whole different game. Maya arrived at the courthouse that afternoon. With a resolve in her chest, she was ready for whatever came next. Her first meeting of the day was with the Chief Justice, Roland Hayes. His face was serious and the tension in the room was palpable. Maya, he said, his voice quiet but firm, I've been reading the news and I'm going to be blunt with you. You're in danger. She nodded. I know. Hayes leaned forward, his fingers laced together on the table. I understand your desire to see this case through, but there's more at stake here than just a courtroom. When your reputation, your career, your very safety could be at risk if you continue down this path. Maya's eyes flashed with defiance. I'm not going anywhere, and neither is this case. Hay hesitated. I don't think you understand the gravity of the situation. You're a target now, and Cole won't stop until he has you out of the picture. Maya shook her head. I'm not scared of him, and I'm not backing down. Hey, I'm not asking you to back down, Maya, but I am asking you to be careful. Maya stood gathering her papers. I'll take it under advisement, Chief, but she knew what she had to do. She wasn't going to let him intimidate her. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to let one man, no matter how powerful, take everything she had worked for the day, moved quickly, and the tension in the courthouse mounted. Brandon Cole had just been brought into the courtroom, and his arrogance seemed to fill the space. He sat with a smug expression on his face, as though he knew something that no one else did. Maya took her seat at the bench, the weight of the room settling around her. She could feel the eyes of everyone on her, waiting for her next move. Mr. Cole, Maya began, her voice cold. Are you ready to proceed? Brandon stood, his hands casually resting on the desk. I'm always ready, Your Honor. His tone was mocking, but Maya wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of responding. She simply nodded. We'll begin the proceedings. The motion to revoke bail will now be heard. The prosecutor, David Ramirez, stood next, Your Honor. As we've argued before, we believe Mr. Cole poses a flight risk. His extensive wealth and international business dealings make him a danger to the integrity of this trial. Brandon chuckled under his breath as though he was amused by the very suggestion. Maya glanced at him, her gaze hardening. Mr. Cole, you may continue to laugh, but I'm warning you, if you continue to disrupt these proceedings, I will have you removed from this courtroom. Brandon's eyes flashed with defiance. I'm not afraid of you. Maya met his gaze unblinking. You should be. Hours later, the courtroom was still tense. The motion was under RR&R. You and the legal arguments had been laid out. But as the proceedings continued, Maya noticed something that made her stomach churn. Brandon wasn't just playing for the courtroom anymore. He was playing for the audience. Maya caught sight of the camera. Crews in the back of the room, their lenses trained on her, and as she glanced over the courtroom, she realized the angle they had chosen. They were framing her. Brandon had orchestrated this perfectly. He was using her every move, every glance, to create a narrative. She was being painted as the villain. The media war was his to lose, and right now it was a fight he was winning. Maya could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of public opinion shifting in his favor, but she knew she had to stick to the facts. She couldn't let him win. With lies, she wasn't just fighting for this case anymore. She was fighting for everything, and she wasn't going to lose. The days following the courtroom showdown with Brandon Cole were some of the most intense of Maya Carter's career. The media frenzy was in full swing, with headlines and news reports swirling around her like a storm. The narrative had shifted, and it seemed like every outlet was echoing the same message. Maya Carter had a personal bias against Brandon Cole. The public was starting to believe it too. She could hear the whispers in the courthouse halls. Even the staff was beginning to look at her with uncertainty. The pressure was mounting, but Maya refused to show weakness. She had fought her way to the top, and she wasn't going to let a billionaire bully her off the bench. Still, even her own team was worried. David Ramirez, her trusted prosecutor, had been trying to get her to take a step back to let someone else handle the case. You don't need this kind of heat. Maya, you've already proven everything you need to. Let's push for a quick trial. Let's get him convicted and move on. But Maya wasn't interested in taking the easy way out. Do you think Cole is just going to give up? She replied sharply. If I back down now, he'll walk. He'll destroy anyone who stands in his way. We have to finish this, David. We're so close. But even she couldn't shake the growing feeling in her gut that this wasn't going to be an easy victory. The media, the public, the pressure, it was all part of Brandon's game, and he was playing it better than anyone ever could have anticipated. Brandon, meanwhile was relishing every moment of his success. Each new story, each new accusation only added to his power. He had always been able to manipulate the system, and now with the media on his side, he was unstoppable in his holding cell. He paced back and forth, his mind racing with plans for the next phase of his strategy. He had people in place, connections that extended beyond the courtroom. And most importantly, he had money. Money made the world go round, and with his resources, he could bend anything and anyone to his will. But it wasn't just the money that made him powerful. It was his confidence, his ability to make everyone believe that they were on his side that was always in control. He smiled as he thought about the next step he needed to meet with his new legal team, but he also needed to prepare for his next move against Maya. She might be strong, she might be tough, but she didn't understand just how much power he had. And once he got her off the case, once he had her removed from the bench, the whole trial would unravel. But first, he needed to send a message. It was late in the evening when Maya received a phone call that made her blood run cold, Judge Carter. "We've just received an anonymous tip," said the voice on the other end of the line. "They're threatening your safety. There's a credible risk to you." Maya's hand gripped the phone tighter, her pulse quickening. "What kind of threat?" The voice hesitated. "We can't confirm everything yet, but it looks like someone close to Cole is involved. We've already alerted security, but we wanted to make sure you were aware." Maya's mind raced. Was this another scare tactic, or was it real? Her thoughts flashed to the note she had received weeks earlier, the one that warned her to step down. She dismissed it then, but now with this new threat, she couldn't ignore it. "I'll take precautions," she said, finally trying to steady her voice. The line went quiet for a moment, and then the voice spoke again, more urgently. "Judge, I don't think you realize just how far this goes. Cole has people everywhere. It's not just about the case anymore." Maya's throat tightened. "What do you mean, just be careful?" "Trust no one." Maya hung up the phone, the weight of the words settling heavily on her shoulders. She wasn't just fighting for the case anymore. She was fighting for her life. The next morning, Maya arrived at the courthouse with a heightened sense of awareness. She kept her head down, moving quickly through the halls, trying to avoid any unnecessary attention. Her security detail was tight today, but she could feel the eyes of the world still focused on her. Every move, she was just about to enter the courtroom when her clerk Daniel rushed up to her. His face paled. "Judge," he said urgently, "there's been a change in the case. You need to see this." He handed her a document, and as Maya scanned it, her eyes widened in disbelief. The motion to have her removed from the case had just taken a shocking turn. Brandon Cole's legal team had filed a formal complaint accusing her of bias. But this time, they had provided evidence, or so they claimed, emails, documents, and most damning of all, an anonymous source who claimed that had been directly involved in illegal dealings related to one of Cole's major business competitors. Her stomach sank. This was it. This was the proof they were going to use to destroy her. The media would eat this up. She could already see the headlines, Judge Carter's dark past. Financial scandals and conflicts of interest. Ma's hands trembled as she folded the papers. Trying to steady herself, she had been in this game long enough to know that nothing was ever as it seemed, and this was another attack, another play from Brandon Cole's playbook. She needed to find out who was behind this, who had planted these lies, and she needed to do it fast. But for now, she had no choice but to play along. As the trial resumed, the courtroom was buzzing with tension. Brandon Cole sat with a smug expression, as though the victory was already his new attorney. Richard Calloway was practically glowing confident that their motion to remove Maya would go through, but Maya wasn't backing down. She stood at the bench, her gaze sweeping over the courtroom. She wasn't going to let them use these fabricated accusations to destroy her. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady but filled with authority, "I will not recuse myself from this case. The claims being made against me are baseless, and I will not let them deter me from delivering." "Justice Brandon." Smirk faltered just slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Your Honor." Calloway interrupted, his voice dripping with false politeness. "We must remind the court that these are not mere accusations. This is evidence, and it deserves to be taken seriously." Maya's grip on the gavel tightened. She was about to give a response when a loud bang echoed through the courtroom, the sound of a gunshot. The gunshot rang through the courtroom like a thunderclap, sending the entire room into a frenzy of movement. Chairs scraped across the floor as people jumped up, shouting, ducking, and scrambling for cover. Security guards rushed in, guns drawn. their voices booming through the chaos as they attempted to regain control. Maya's heart raced in her chest. Her instincts kicked in, pushing her to move quickly to take control of the situation. But her mind was racing just as fast, searching for answers. Who fired? The shot was someone targeting me? The sound of people screaming echoed through her ears as she ducked behind her bench, her hand gripping the gavel as if it could offer any kind of protection. The seconds felt like hours. Finally, the courtroom fell silent, save for the distant murmur of police radio and the frantic pacing of the officers slowly. Maya stood, her eyes scanning the room. She could feel her heart pounding in her ears. She looked at the defense table where Brandon Cole sat with his hands on the desk, his face as calm as ever. Not a hint of fear, not a flicker of concern. He was watching her, watching the chaos unfold like he had orchestrated it all. Maya Ems's voice broke through the noise as he approached her cautiously. "Are you okay?" Maya swallowed her breath shallow. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. She wasn't fine. She wasn't sure what had just happened, but she knew it wasn't a coincidence. She turned to the officers, her gaze hardening. "What the situation?" One of the officers, his face pale, spoke quickly. "We've cleared the room, Your Honor. No one's injured. We're reviewing the security footage now." Maya nodded curtly. "I need to know who did this now." Back in her chambers, Maya paced back and forth. Her mind was spinning. Whoever had fired that shot knew exactly what they were doing. They were sending a message. She had no doubt in her mind that it was linked to the case, linked to Brandon Cole. The gunshot wasn't just a random act of violence, it was a warning. She felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She couldn't keep playing on defense. The stakes were higher than ever if she allowed Cole to control the narrative any longer. If she allowed him to manipulate the press and intimidate her, she'd lose everything she couldn't afford to lose. Not now, not when everything she had fought for was within reach. Maya exhaled, pushing the fear down. She needed to find out who was behind this, and she needed to do it quickly. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from David Ramirez. "Judge, we have something. Call me immediately." It didn't take long for Maya to reach Ramirez. "Talk to me," she said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind in her mind. "We got access to the footage," Ramirez said quickly. "And we've confirmed something." "The gunshot came from inside the courtroom, but it wasn't directed at you." Ma's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "Security says the shot was fired from a position near the back of the room where Cole's supporters were seated. We're still working through it, but we have reason to believe this was an attempt to send a message to you without actually hurting you." Ma's eyes narrowed. "You're telling me someone was trying to intimidate me, but they missed." "That's exactly it." Maya was silent for a moment, absorbing the information. "I need to meet with the Chief Justice." "Understood. I'll arrange it." But Maya Ramirez hesitated. "If this is Cole's doing and escalating, we can't let him control this anymore." Monk's voice was calm but filled with conviction. "I know it's time to take back control." The meeting with the Chief Justice was scheduled for the following afternoon. Maya walked into the Chief Justice's office. Her steps determined, the weight of the situation pressed down on her. But she wasn't backing down now. She knew what she had to do. Maya Chief Justice Hayes greeted her with a somber expression. "What's going on?" "I'm taking control of this case," Maya said bluntly, "and I'm moving forward with it, no matter what threats come our way." Hayes raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure? The pressure is immense. Cole's not just using the legal system anymore in going after you personally." "I'm aware of that," Maya replied, her voice unwavering. "But I've been in this game long enough to know that if we give up now, we let him win. I won't allow that." Hayes studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, I'm not going to stand in your way, but know this, if you proceed, you'll be facing more than just legal battles. You'll be facing a war, one that could cost you everything." Maya's expression hardened. "Then let's go to war." Back in the courtroom, the trial resumed. The air was thick with tension, but Maya was no longer rattled. The gunshot, the threats, the public backlash, it all seemed insignificant compared to what she was about to do. "Mr. Cole," Maya's voice rang out across the courtroom, her gaze fixed on him. "You've manipulated this case. You've manipulated the public, and now you've tried to intimidate me." Brandon's smirk never wavered. "I'm just playing the game, Judge. You can't blame me for that." Maya's eyes narrowed. "You're right, you are playing a game. But so am I." She turned to the court officers. "I'm issuing a full, immediate investigation into the events of yesterday. We will not proceed with this trial until we have full clarity on what happened." Brandon's face twisted into a frown, but it was too late. "You've played your hand. Mr. Cole, Maya said, her voice steady but full of finality. And now it's my turn. She slammed her gavel down. Court is adjourned, days passed, and the investigation into the gunshot revealed the truth. It was a well-calculated move. The gun had been fired by one of Cole's associates, someone in his inner circle who had hoped to provoke a response. But Maya had turned the tables. The investigation was covered extensively, with media outlets turning their attention to Cole's manipulation of the system. The narrative had shifted. Maya wasn't the villain anymore. Kay was finally, after weeks of legal battles and media storms. The trial concluded. Brandon Cole was convicted of his numerous crimes, his empire crumbling beneath him. The public was outraged and the media exposed the truth about his connections, his crimes, and his attempts to silence anyone who stood in his way. As for Maya Carter, she stood tall. She had survived, she had won, and she had proven that even the most powerful billionaire couldn't control the system, not when justice was on the line.